I'd like to consider the meaning of President Obama's visit to Hiroshima on May 27, 2016, and I'd like to consider why, as a historian, it mattered so much that for the first time a sitting President of the United States visited the city that the United States released its first atomic weapon during wartime. Many anticipated this event. There was intense focus on what Obama would say, what would be included in his speech, what would not be included in his speech. Many didn't want him to go at all, saying the United States had no reason to visit, to apologize. Many lambasted the trip as an apology tour. Many also, an equal if not greater number, had long called for such a visit to really begin the process of healing between those who survived the terrible bombing that occurred there and also the history that followed after. Possibly the most important moment occurred when President Obama, without planning, embraced a survivor named Mori Shigeaki, a historian living in the city who had long worked to bring little-known facts of the event of August 6, 1945, to the fore. We know the basic facts of the day. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima burst into flames as the result of the United States releasing the first atomic weapon during war against a civilian population. The civilian population was at war, and for this reason, many of those who said the visit should not take place did not want Obama to visit. Survivors, however, and their supporters have long called for such a visit to really affirm the process of US-Japan relations, but more important, to affirm the reality of their lives, the reality of the tragedy they suffered, and the reality of the difficulties of survival in the wake of this bombing. We also know that another city was bombed several days later, Nagasaki, on August 9, 1945. We know that conservative estimates alone combine the death toll at roughly 200,000. So we know that thousands and thousands died in these attacks. We also know that thousands and thousands survived these attacks. And it's really the survivors who have given voice to the history that took place that day in ways that obviously the dead cannot, but also in ways that made this part of the relationship between Japan and the United States for the decades that followed August 1945. You could die in three ways in these attacks, these bombings, and that makes the mediation, the consideration of how to discuss these deaths, unusual. You could die from blast, from burn, or from something new called radiation sickness. And this new disease, this new way of death, is what has created a very deep sense of unease in how to narrate this particular history that took place during the end of the Second World War. Possibly the best way to learn or to teach about this comes in Hachiya Michihiko's Hiroshima Diary. This was first translated in 1955 and remains an absolutely stark portrayal of life on the streets for those who didn't know what had fallen out of the sky, but had clearly changed their lives forever. Insofar as there was no word in Japanese at the time to describe what had happened. And the reason this book and Dr. Hachiya's memory of this moment remains so powerful in terms of teaching and learning from this moment is precisely as a medical doctor, his first response was to figure out what had happened and to try to provide care for those who were dying around him. He couldn't figure out what they were dying from. And it's in his discussion of how people were dying and how people were surviving that it becomes possible to realize that a very different history was unfolding in Hiroshima and then subsequently also in Nagasaki. The United States has long had a what I would call a history problem with learning from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We've long had a history problem with Hiroshima and Nagasaki because of this new way of dying. Looked at differently, more Japanese died in American fire bombings of other cities in Japan during World War II. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki new way of death created an unease with how America would be able to describe winning the war. And one way of looking at this is the so-called numbers game approach to these particular histories, by which I mean that often the number has become so inflated that Americans are taught that millions of lives were saved. And so in an effort to sort of downplay the cost of death, but the reality of death in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right away, the projected number of casualties for American troops that would have invaded Japan's homeland had Japan not surrendered rapidly increased. In November 1944, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey estimated 40,000 U.S. troop deaths in the event of an invasion of Japan proper. Now that is already a very high number, and it's not in a sense of downplaying that, but rather as a historian, what's interesting is that almost right away that number doubled, then it quadrupled. Now it stands as either 1 million or 2 million, depending on whom you ask. And it's in that rather unhistorical process that it's possible to realize an American unease with these particular histories. What happened in considering how we teach and learn from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and again, why President Obama's visit to Hiroshima really will help Americans understand how these histories have impacted our own understandings of the events, is that in the American telling of these bombings, we've substituted the guessed number of deaths that ultimately did not happen. There was no land invasion by the United States or Allied forces of Japan proper. Those projected number of deaths have come to replace the number of people who actually died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in a way that makes clear that we are not comfortable with this particular history, as was also made clear by the number of people that encouraged President Obama not to go. In surviving Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one became a person known as a Hibakusha, a survivor of these particular bombings. This too was a new word in Japanese, and it continues to carry deep social connotations. People lived with grotesque disfigurements. They lived with social ostracism that entailed they couldn't get married because they were poisoned and they couldn't possibly have children, things that have not necessarily proven correct, but a social stigma attached to their lives as well. So it's really through the survivors themselves that the history, the reality of living with the bomb is embodied. How have survivors come to tell their own histories? Often through teaching, often through doing research on what happened around them on that day. Many describe intense feelings of guilt they have for surviving when family members did not, when people they were standing with did not. And so many who were children at the time have spent their lives building lives by learning the history of what took place around them. So what can we learn from President Obama's visit? Why did it matter so much? He met with Tsuboi Sunao and shook his hand, and Mr. Tsuboi explained how grateful he was for Obama coming to visit and acknowledge. Now, some have downplayed this and said that that's really what the current administration of Japan wanted, that Prime Minister Abe wanted to score such a moment for political gain, and in many respects that's true. An astonishing 98% of Japanese have expressed their pleasure with this visit. At the same time, the question of what that unscripted embrace that I showed at the outset of these slides with Mori Shigeaki actually accomplished is something that may likely have a much deeper significance. Mr. Mori said in an interview the next day that Mr. Obama's hand was very warm, and nobody had ever actually paid attention to what he, Mr. Mori, had spent his life doing, but, quote unquote, when he, President Obama, listened to my story, I felt that my efforts were rewarded. Mori also said that he hoped that Obama's visit to Hiroshima would help Americans who didn't know about American POWs who had died in the bombings to learn more about that. This particular aspect of the American bombing of Hiroshima, the deaths of American POWs trapped in the Hiroshima area at the time, is little known in the actual history telling within the United States. Mr. Mori had made that particular aspect of the history his lifelong work. And from that work, Mr. Mori wants Americans to better understand the reality of what happened that day. Now, this really, to me, gets at the heart of the process of historical reconciliation, which is very, very different from using history to position oneself politically. Through Modi's words, through President Obama's actions of actually touching, breaking down, and hugging this man, Mr. Modi had looked up into Obama's eyes, and there were tears in them, and President Obama leaned down and hugged him. In that single moment, it became possible to give humanity to a broad group of victims, both dead and survivors, that what they had endured was worth learning from. Mr. Modi then has spoken with American high school students to say very much the same thing, to explain to them what they could take back with them to learn from these events. This is how to learn from history, to use history productively, rather than to create an us versus them approach to a very contentious moment in the 20th century. Modi said that he really believes that Obama meant that a world free of nuclear weapons was not an empty process. Quote, he really cares about world peace and strives to achieve it. He was not just saying it to be nice. And it's from this that it's possible to see a greater possibility for how Hiroshima's history, how Nagasaki's history can lead to a better world, because in essence, that's really the point of learning from the past. The broader picture of history and reconciliation, for some, is best embodied as a sort of beginning process with Chancellor Willy Brandt kneeling in 1970 at the Warsaw Ghetto Monument, and he didn't say any words, just as Obama didn't himself say any words at the time to Mr. Modi, but the physical gesture of acknowledging a greater history involved, and something that still is very deeply felt by survivors, by those who were there, is what President Obama's visit accomplished. To me, there are ways of teaching this that are well beyond just U.S.-Japan relations and the history of Japan. I think for many of us living in the United States, it's instructive to think how we could make progress with Native Americans. In particular, I think of a colleague in Connecticut who 400 years ago, when his progenitors were slayed in the Pequot War, recently held the sword that had been used in that battle. He himself did not ask for an apology from the descendant of the man who had perpetrated the war. Rather, he needed acknowledgement that his people had suffered and they had survived. And that really is something that President Obama's recent visit to Hiroshima enables us to put that moment, this broader history, as part of an expansive use and consideration of how history is visiting the past in order to learn from it to make the world a better place is best understood. These are just some considerations. Thanks.